Hello, this video is on the social model recovery, cultivating the secret sauce, and it's a part of the Texas Recovery Residence Manager Training. The social model sometimes has been referred to as the roux and a really good gumbo, meaning that it's the secret sauce. It's you can throw a bunch of items in a pot, boil it up, but that's not gumbo. What makes the gumbo is that good roux. The roux coats everything. It makes it taste super good. It's the secret sauce. And with that metaphor, we can call the social model the roux and a really good recovery residence gumbo. So this slide may seem familiar. It was in an earlier video, and it's a look at NAR's levels of support. NAR looked across the United States and generally categorized the different types of recovery residences out there into four levels. What you can notice is the social model is an element that exists in all four kinds, all types of recovery residences. And so this video is really kind of talking about, so what is the kind of theory and the concepts and the philosophies underneath all our recovery residences? Our recovery residences probably and many times should look very different for different populations and different levels of support, and really kind of what your particular recovery residence looks like, the flavor, if you will. But underneath that is this core philosophy and approach. And by going through these different concepts today, I'm hoping that you can reflect upon that and start understanding, oh, this is what we're doing and why. And it just helps you be more mindful of that. So what is the social model recovery? Well, it's been called lots of different things over the past. Sometimes it's called community model recovery or social community model. I've heard it called social model recovery or just social model for short. But essentially, it is philosophies and practices that are oftentimes used to contrast from the clinical model or the medical model. Comparatively, it emphasizes the social aspects of recovery. It sees recovery as the common bond that everybody in the program or the recovery residences has. And it values experiential knowledge and mutual support. It also believes that recovery is a person-driven, lifelong, and holistic process. And all this together really is what makes it a chronic care approach. And addiction is a chronic disease, and so the social model is a great approach to addiction. Where is the social model being used today? Well, obviously, we're talking about it in the context of recovery residences, and it's the foundation of all recovery residences, so it's here. But in addition to that, we can see the philosophy being used in recovery community organizations who often operate recovery community centers. We can see elements in the collegiate recovery programs and centers, recovery high schools, professional monitoring programs, and many, many others. And remember, these are philosophies. These are concepts. And we're going to talk about them today kind of in its purest form. But oftentimes you'll see recovery residences that are using both the social model recovery philosophy in combination with the medical model or clinical model. And it's just important to be very mindful of the two, so one doesn't the treatment model doesn't end up undermining the social model. So where did the social model come from? Well, Dr. Thomasita Borkman did a lot of research on this in the 80s and 90s, and she traces it back to the 1940s with the emergence of AA homes, and when people started using the term social model recovery. It can really traced all the way into the 80s with the California social model homes. But really, we can trace these philosophies and elements back as far as the Washingtonians in the 1840s when they were opening up recovery housing. They may not have used the language social model, but when we start looking at the concepts, they can be traced way, way back. Things have evolved over time, and the social model programs are really the predecessor of addiction treatment that we think of today. And we have this whole Renaissance movement around recovery. And so we start seeing the social model being talked about more and more, and its philosophies being implemented across a wider range of settings. So why the social model? Well, addiction costs the United States over 600 billion in healthcare costs, criminal justice dollars, and lost productivity. And it's because addiction's a chronic illness. So it's no surprise that the longer that someone stays in a treatment or recovery residence setting, a structured setting, the more likely they are to remain abstinent and improve quality of life aspects across everything. When we start thinking about how expensive a 30-day treatment program is, and the fact that 50% of the individuals that only go to a 30-day treatment program are going to relapse within 12 months, it gets really frustrating. And we shouldn't blame 30-day treatment. It's doing what it does in 30 days. What we need to be thinking about is recovery oriented system of care, recovery management of initiating someone in the recovery process and then not pulling support away. It's looking at, so what types of support do we need to provide them as their recovery evolves over time? If addiction is a chronic illness, all other chronic illnesses, we're thinking about a 5-year window. I'm not saying that somebody needs to be in a recovery residence for 5 years, but along the way, we need to look at, so what types of support services does an individual need at any given time? And NAR's 4 levels of support really fit within that continuum. When we think about individuals that are returning from treatment or really hospitals or criminal justice system, if they go back to the environments that enable their addictive lifestyles, we shouldn't be shocked that they relapse either. So this is another reason why getting them connected into a social model program gets better results. It's transferring them from that culture of addiction and planting them into a culture of recovery. So all in all, it's very cost effective. Social model programs are very cost effective and starts matching the needs of individuals as they move along that continuum of support. So trying to get our head, all right, never talking about social model, what does it actually look like? How can we get our head around it? So Dr. Leon Kaskudis in the 90s created this assessment tool. And it was created because there were some things that happened in the 80s and 90s that had many treatment centers moving away from social model concepts towards medical model or clinical model concepts. And so she wanted to develop this assessment tool for treatment centers to kind of track, how fast and how far they were moving away from social model philosophy. And we can use that scale and these 6 domains to better understand, so what is it that we're talking about when it comes to social model philosophy? As you can see, 33 items across 6 domains, and those domains being physical environment, staff role, authority base, what I call recovery orientation, governance, and community orientation. I'll also preface this, well, we're going to go through kind of the theory or concepts here. In the upcoming webinar, we're going to have experts, nearly 100 years worth of recovery expertise on a speaker panel that is going to be talking about, so how does this theory actually manifest inside a recovery residence and across the different levels of support? So first is physical environment. And, a recovery residence feels like a home. I mean, that's one of the biggest things when you walk in, architecturally, does it feel like a home? Is it homey? Is it architecturally set up to support a lot of community interaction for people to come together and cook meals, to have house meetings? Is it conducive for staff and the residents or participants to interact with one another and talk? So the philosophy scale of this domain measures to what degree does the residence feel like a home. One more thing I'll add is looking at, so how much of the square footage is dedicated to office space or a group room that people can't access otherwise, and then how much of the space is really community space and space that the residents use on a daily basis. The next is staff role. So the tool measures to what degree is staff considered respected peers rather than this powerential difference as distant supervisors. So this social model philosophy really encourages staff to mingle with participants. So that could look like a lunch line, smoker's corner, wherever the residents are, rather than them only interacting with them when they come to group or in those hour sessions once or twice a week. Some of the best insight and feedback and interactions happen in these informal settings. And so that's why what is really advocated within social model of recovery. Next is authority based. Dr. Kaskudis' scale measures to what degree is authority based on lived experience. In social model programs, most of the employees are in recovery, especially the direct care staff. Often they are alumni of the program. It believes that recovery, the process of recovery, imparts experiential knowledge that can't be replaced. It's not that it undermines or discounts professional knowledge, but it doesn't hold professional knowledge any higher than experiential knowledge. So you've got professionals in the case of the higher levels of support that bring peers in and really look at how together they can support the individual's recovery. Next is this concept of recovery orientation. To what degree is the problem seen as or let me reframe that. To what degree is recovery seen as a person-driven, lifelong, and whole person process? The opposite would be to see, well, the problem really is the addiction, and we only need to address the addiction, and then that's it. Social model programs really take this more holistic approach and believe it's about empowering the individual. How can we build their recovery capital? How can we build their self-confidence? How can we give them some life tools so that for the rest of their life, they can live recovery? Next is the concept of governance, or the domain of governance. So social model programs utilize peers to establish and reinforce program rules. Rather than having this us versus them mentality, it's more like, nope, this is our community, this is our rules. I'm not only holding myself accountable, I'm holding everyone else accountable, not to be mean, but is a way of supporting each other in recovery. Again, this is life skill tools. This is what they need to be doing for the rest of their life, even when they move out of the recovery residences, finding individuals that hold them accountable in their recovery and vice versa. This creates a feeling of being more invested in the program and in their own recovery, and it helps develop new skills. Next is community orientation. To what degree is the community seen as a resource? Individuals must learn how to reach out and connect with a web of support in the community that could look like friends, mentors, social activities, employment opportunities, any number of resources. And so in social model programs, we're really actively connecting individuals, encouraging individuals to go out and connect with the greater recovery community, with the greater community itself. Even like finding those resources and it's supporting them along that. It's about teach a man to fish, teach a man to find resources in the community, and when appropriate, it's inviting the greater community into the recovery residence. So moving on to some other related concepts, and again, this is across all recovery residences when we're looking at, so what's the theory and concepts behind what we do? I want to cover three more. One is recovery culture immersion. Next, we'll talk about the psychological sense of community, and we'll end talking about recovery self-efficacy. So first is recovery culture immersion. So the social model helps individuals replace the social, interpersonal, and cultural aspects of their addiction with recovery. Earlier I mentioned that oftentimes we are stuck in a lifestyle, in a culture of addiction. And the process of recovery is about taking that individual out of that mindset, of that self-identity, and transplanting them into a culture of recovery. And there's no better culture of recovery than recovery residences. Culture really has a big influence, both in our addictive lifestyles as well as our recovery lifestyles. So much of our self-identity, I remember when I was first entering into recovery, the concept of not being a person that identifies with using or understanding what would life be like not using, I just didn't have any construct around that. I think it's helpful for us to think about what defines culture. You know, um, Families have culture, friends have culture. There's even culture within our workplaces. Each culture has their leaders, their icons, their heroes. Oftentimes, culture is framed with literature, art, and music. Language that's used within a particular culture or subculture is oftentimes very indicative or reinforces that culture, as well as symbols and artifacts, and of course, beliefs, traditions, and rituals. In the addiction recovery field, we often talk about people, places, and things. So those are elements that shape this concept of culture. Another concept to keep in mind is that people are coming with different addiction enmeshments, if you will. Bill White, in his book Pathways from the Culture of Addiction to the Culture of Recovery, kind of breaks this cultural influence down into three subsections. There are individuals that we'll say are acultural. They developed their disease of addiction really with very little influence from others around them. Then you've got individuals who are bicultural, meaning they had one foot in a culture of addiction and one foot in a culture of recovery, or really kind of in the culture of normal, healthy activities. So that person may be straight A student by day and heroin user by night, or somebody that is very successful business person during the week and then is a drug warrior on the weekends. So that's this kind of bicultural element. And then the third subgroup is people that are just completely culturally enmeshed. They may not know anyone in their family, in their neighborhood, in their workplace that does not use. And so as residents move in, you can try to get a sense of how deeply enmeshed were they in a culture of addiction, and kind of raising that awareness for them and getting them connected with people in recovery can help them have that transformative process. I just wanted to highlight, subcultures. We definitely have subcultures in addiction. Alcoholics definitely have a different culture. They listen to different music. They have a different feel and energy than people who are pot smokers. Pot smokers have their own language, 420, their own icons and music that they listen to, which is very different than the heroes and authors around LSD. And we can go right down the line. Cocaine has its own symbols. Meth has its own habits and feels and rituals. Speaking of rituals, heroin has very specific rituals that occur and help create this kind of heroin subculture, as well as all the party drugs, ecstasy, MDMA, and then we can look at the process disorders, gambling and eating. All those these are very distinct subcultures. We can also look to recovery, and recovery has different subcultures. Oftentimes, you hear many pathways to recovery, and I hear that and think that there are many subcultures of recovery. And just like you can be part of different recovery subcultures, you can be part of different pathways. Of course, there's the different 12-step pathways, AA, NA, CMA, all the different A's. Dual recovery, individuals who are in recovery from both mental health and substance use issues, individuals who are in recovery from sex addiction. You have SA, SAA, SLA. They have a different book and they kind of different rituals that look kind of like a 12-step, but are definitely distinct. You have the more secular approaches to recovery, smart recovery, rational recovery. The more faith-based type of recovery, celebrate recovery, refuge recovery, and then Dharma punks and straight edge, very, very different, and has a specific cultural feel. We have more and more individuals who are choosing methadone and Suboxone along their pathway to recovery. That's oftentimes called medication-assisted treatment, or MAT. I will reframe that and say, let's call it medication-assisted recovery, MAR. Restorative justice is popular in different areas, especially for individuals coming out of the criminal justice system or who are criminally justice involved. And then lastly, recovery residences. Each one of them can have their different subculture of recovery. One last thing as far as culture, I think that as we get a better understanding of trauma and how that can drive the addictive process, as well as influence the process of recovery, I think the cutting edge of culture within recovery residences is going to start using trauma-informed lens and learning. So how can we support individuals within our recovery residences from a trauma-informed perspective? I think this is especially important that now that we're in the midst of the heroin epidemic, the opioid epidemic, there's a lot of trauma that's happening, and even secondary trauma as we lose our brothers and sisters to the disease. Next, we'll move to this concept of psychological sense of community. So a sense of community has a lot of different benefits. It increases this sense of citizenship, and the Betty Ford definition of recovery is what is oftentimes called the citizenship definition, because it really highlights that is a part of the recovery process. It increases mutual aid, or this reciprocal responsibility, this kind of the supporting each other within the recovery residence. It also influences one's self-identity. And earlier we were talking about the importance of switching our identity as being a person who uses or who is addicted to that of a person who's in recovery. So a sense of community can facilitate that. Research shows that it increases happiness as measured by subjective wellness, and it deepens and lengthens engagement. So if a recovery residents didn't do anything else but get people engaged and provide a safe, sober living environment to give the recovery process some time, then developing a sense of community helps keep them engaged and gives them more runway. I always say that the longer the runway, the better someone flies. And I would also argue that recovery residences do a lot more than just create a safe container, a safe living environment. There's a lot more elements, and many of them we're talking about in this video. And finally, there's research that shows that a sense of community also increases self-efficacy, and that's the topic that we'll talk about last within this video. So how do we develop a sense of community, or how is a sense of community developed? Well, Gusfield talks about, there is this sense of community that is developed through proximity. So, based on someone's geography. So if you and I are living in the same neighborhood, or you and I go to the same school, or you and I live in the same recovery residence, there's this natural sense of community that could possibly develop. There's also relational senses of community. So similar characteristics, interests, or beliefs. Are you and I both left-handed? Do we have the same color eyes? Do we go to the same church? Are we both in recovery? So kind of bringing those two together, we're both proximal and relational, we can see that a sense of community just inherently is being developed within recovery residences. But let's talk about some other concepts that will allow us to, mindfully cultivate that to a much higher degree. Probably one of the most well-known papers written on sense of community was published by McMillan and Chavez. Either that paper is either part of your pre-assignments, or it could be a part of your optional reading for this course. But essentially, they broke the elements of a sense of community down into four: membership, fulfillment, influence, and emotional connection. So first, we can look at sense of community, or developing a sense of community through this notion of membership or belonging. Oftentimes, individuals want to know, are they eligible? Are you in the club or are you out of the club? So that creates this sense of community. And definitely as individuals apply for recovery residence, they're being screened in a way to make sure that they are appropriate fit for the community. And so that inherently creates this sense of eligibility or a sense of membership. And we can actually highlight that as individuals are first moving into the recovery residence, and you take them through the orientation. The other way that you can cultivate this sense of membership is social covenants, maybe house rules. As a community, what have we decided to abide by? As individuals and members of this household, this is how we behave. That's a way of developing a sense of community. And ultimately what we're doing is trying to create this sense of emotional safety. So we're in early recovery, especially, we're so guarded, and we're not willing to share. We're not willing to be vulnerable enough to look at certain situations. And so if we can create a culture, create a framework that allows people to really show up and have the emotional safety to process through things, that goes a long way. Another way that we can develop this sense of membership is through common symbols, rituals, and ceremonies. Next, we'll be looking at how can we cultivate a feeling of influence. A person who dominates and ignores the wishes and opinions of others are often the least powerful member of the group. I like that quote because oftentimes when we get frustrated as residence managers, we go in and just start telling people to do X, Y, and Z, bark out orders and do it because I said so. And that may be a shortcut and maybe as a result of us feeling ungrounded or losing our temper, but it starts undermining this sense of community. It creates this power differential, and it has people start checking out. Members must feel empowered to have influence. Otherwise, they will not be motivated to participate. Now, there's a balancing act that happens. Of course, there is framework. Of course, there are situations where it's important to be very clear and directive. But we also need to look at ways of how do we keep people engaged? How do we have them feel like they're a part of this community, not just an object or just kind of biding their time before they exit. Next is cultivating the sense of an emotional connection. McMillan and Chavez called this the soul of the community. And I think that's the one thing when you walk into a recovery residence is you can feel the community. And we don't oftentimes know how to articulate that because this spirit, this emotional connection, is very ethereal. And it's emotional connection is the commitment and belief that members share a history, a common place, a time together, and similar experiences. So as you cultivate this recovery in your home, this sense of community, these things start happening. And one way to solidify it is to give voice to it. You can talk about the soul of the community and how you can cultivate it. This perceived sense of community has been researched within recovery residences. Dr. Leonard Jason, who primarily focuses on Oxford houses, which is a form of it's probably the most well-known level 1 recovery residence that exists. They developed this scale that measured mission, reciprocal responsibility, and harmony. Mission defined as shared goals and ideals, reciprocal responsibility being the shared responsibility or that mutual support that happens within a recovery residence. And harmony was defined as rapport, fellowship, and just a general sense of amicability. So I think there's more research to be done on this, but really it's looking at so to what degree is this sense of social, this what degree is this sense of community being cultivated within the recovery residents, and then measuring the recovery outcomes that happen due to that. So our final topic is one of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is the belief that one can successfully perform a task or behavior change. It's a big deal in social cognitive theory. It looks like actions and reactions, including social behaviors and cognitive processes, are influenced by the actions observed in others. Influential in determining the outcomes of many events, including addiction recovery. So it's the belief that I can recover as evidenced by the recovery that's happening around me. Which brings us to the abstinence-specific self-efficacy. So the confidence and ability to abstain from substances. You know, they've researched this. It's a strong predictor of abstinence at 1-year follow-up, as well as long-term recovery outcomes as far as 16 years. So it may not be a word that you've heard before, self-efficacy, but it is a strong predictor of both short-term and long-term outcomes. One of the research that I'll highlight that was specifically done within recovery residences, or even more specific to Oxford House, is looking at, recovery residences are bolstering this sense of self-efficacy that I can recover as evidenced by the people that I'm living with. I can remain abstinent. That what we do know is that individuals that are leaving 30-day addiction treatment centers are oftentimes have really low self-efficacy. And those that have a higher self-efficacy tend to do better than those that are coming out of treatment and just really believe that they can't recover, or there's just no way they can remain abstinent. There's something that happens in the recovery process once someone reaches about 6 months of recovery, 6 months of abstinence. They start building some confidence of like, man, I might be able to do this. So one theory is that what's happening within recovery residences is that we're bolstering individuals' sense of self-efficacy when they're probably the most vulnerable, those first 6 months. So if we can just get them through that first 6 months to where they start having confidence that recovery is something for them, then we've done our life, what we can. There's research that shows that individuals that are living in a recovery residence at least 6 months have much better outcomes measured by employment, by abstinence rates, by improved mental health, as well as the decreased involvement with criminal justice. And this specific study looked at Oxford House residences that have individuals living in Oxford House had higher self-efficacy than those that were not living in Oxford houses or any recovery residence that was just going to 12-step. So there's something specific that's happening in recovery residences that is cultivating self-efficacy. So as you're working and managing your recovery residences, and oftentimes wonder, so what is it that's happening, and how can I reinforce that? How can I mindfully support this? You can think about social model of recovery domains. You can think about recovery culture. You can think about cultivating the sense of community, and you can think about building self-efficacy. Kind of wrapping everything up is this quote from Malcolm X: "When I is replaced with we, even illness becomes wellness." Thank you.